Hello again, my faithful audience, and those of you who are just checking in. This is the Heart Journey Home podcast. Welcome. I have been reflecting on a few ideas lately, which I'm sure those of you who've gotten to know me don't find surprising in the least. One of the things I've been, the thing that I've been reflecting on in preparation for this is something that, okay, let me back up a little bit. I was thinking the other day how we happen to live in this unprecedented prosperity. The world is so full of options, so full of things to do and things to buy, and anything we might need we can get. It's incredible that the world has evolved in this direction where so many different people have made so many different things available. And there's a couple of things that are just clamoring for our attention all the time. Attention has become the new commodity, especially like in what I've noticed in my own life is a particular struggle is giving my attention over to Facebook Reels and YouTube Shorts and just these instant hits of dopamine. If only we exchange a little bit of our time and a little bit of our attention to these social media platforms, they will provide us with hits of dopamine that help to regulate unconscious emotions. However, unfortunately, they are very much like the broken wells that Jeremiah talks about. These broken wells that don't even hold water. You keep going back to them to satiate your thirst, and they just give diminishing. It's these sorts of devices that we've attached ourselves to, expecting them to promise, that they promise certain outcomes. But the more we go back to them, the less of those outcomes they actually deliver. It's like drinking seawater to quench your thirst. It only makes you more thirsty. And so it's an imperfect strategy. And so we try to limit ourselves, obviously. But limits are like the only thing that modern society doesn't provide for us. It's almost like the world demands everything of you. And it's not the world's job to say when's enough. It's actually our job. And many of us, we're a bit slow on the uptake there. We haven't learned yet how to place boundaries between us and the world. In many places, it used to be that our communities would provide those boundaries. We experience them as rules. We experience them as social norms within our little enclaves. But and sometimes they felt oppressive. But now we seem to have swung the opposite way. And where once we had, strict boundaries, sort of keeping us from feeling free, now we've got absolute freedom that's keeping us from feeling held together. When boundaries are dropped, there is nothing separating you from chaos and hustle and stress of the world. We become overwhelmed. We become anxious because there's nothing protecting us from everything. We get swept away in a sea of undifferentiated activity. Burnham has a song relating to how the internet emerged on the scene quite innocuously at first, but then evolved into this almost maniacal presence in all of our lives. And it's, the catchphrase of the internet is, what did he say? Would you like a bit of everything all of the time? Boredom is a crime. And many of us, especially, people younger than myself, who've grown up in that ubiquity, this is normal now. It's normal not to have any boundaries. It's normal to exist in a world that's grabbing for your attention all the time. It's normal to kind of have to forfeit parts of your own soul in order to survive in that kind of environment. And the handheld phones that we carry open the door to everything all of the time invading our space, demanding our attention, notifications going off at all hours of the day, and apps being specifically designed to target vulnerabilities in human psychology, making us addicted, going to these empty wells, these broken wells that don't even hold water. Now, it's an interesting polarity that we have here. Too much boundaries feels oppressive. It's hard for us to grow under those conditions because there's no freedom. But at the same time, too much freedom means that we lack direction, we lack purpose, we lack autonomy. No, we have absolute autonomy, but we have no direction. It was actually my ex-wife who pointed this out to me at first a few years ago. She described it like there's an axis. There's two axes, one being freedom and one being direction. And she said the conservatives seem to have absolute purpose and direction, but there's no freedom in that camp. And then in the opposite camp, you've got absolute freedom, but lack of direction. And I thought that is a very astute observation. And I think she was right. I think these represent two polar opposite positions that ideally ought to be balanced. And it's not the world's job to figure out that balance for us, partly because there's no profit in it. But the other reason is because everyone is different. Everyone needs a different kind of balance. Everyone is going to be attracted to one community or another that provides a different ratio of these things. And so we have absolute freedom in the world. That seems to be where things are headed. Absolute freedom. But because of that, we have to balance this, this equation ourselves. We have to place boundaries on ourselves. We need to create our own intentions. We need to set who we are and where we're going so that in saying yes to something, we can say no to everything else. That is a difficult thing to learn in a world that is designed to steal our attention, to entice and tempt us into paying for things and spending our time and our energy that distract us. I remember praying about this a few years ago, and what I felt like God was sort of revealing to me was that it's your job to decide what you want in life. But if you don't decide what you want and where you want to go, the world will provide all manner of options for you. If you don't decide first where you're going, what matters to you, the world will bring to you all kinds of options, suggestions. And I've seen that play out, actually. I kind of like that notion that we have the freedom, but part of that freedom is saying yes to all the things that knock on our door and tempt us in one or another direction. So, I wanted to talk about probably one of the oldest concepts of these boundaries. Actually, before we get to that, did you know the word tempted comes from the word test? As in, imagine you're building something, and you need to kind of put some weight on it so that you can tell that that it's strong, that it's robust, that it's got integrity to it. And then you put some weight to it, and it sort of breaks or it buckles in one direction. Temptation refers to that kind of testing. Some weight has been put on you, on your character, and you've buckled in a certain area. Now, is that a failure? Is that something that we should have low self-esteem around? Should our egos take a hit? It's like, no, not at all. It's revealing where you still need work. So you pick yourself up after having made some oversight or mistake. You've been tempted, you've fallen to that temptation. Okay, there might be consequences, but now it's time to notice why you fell to that temptation, why you had a weakness for that thing, and then start building yourself up. And next time you're tested, it will reveal whether you passed the test or not. This notion, it's explored a couple of times in the Bible as, the process where a smith would purify silver, let's say. They heat it up, the impurities rise to the surface of the liquid silver, and they scoop off the impurities. Then they heat it up again, and maybe a few more impurities come up. And they'll keep doing that several times until there is no more impurities. That is testing. That is temptation. And I thought, I like that. It sort of takes away the stigma of being tempted as being this fundamental evil. It's like, no, the world is full of temptations. In a way, you can't be tempted unless you have a goal that you're falling short of. If you didn't have any goals and the world was saying, come over here, go over there are no temptations. They're just goals. But if you if you know you're trying to be, let's say, and you fall short of that reveals temptations. If something comes along that's telling you to leave the path that you've already committed to, that's a temptation. Or at least that's how it appears to me. Now, again, returning to form of boundary setting, the Old Testament notion of clean and unclean. Now, this is a motif. For the longest time, I had zero interest in. I'm someone who deeply into Leviticus and sort of deconstructs in how the tab made all things, like analyzing these to years in biblical. That's not my area. But I discovered something in that I thought, oh, this is fascinating. Forget what the rules were around clean and unclean. Let's sort of take it even sort of below that and think about, what does clean and unclean even mean? Now, the first thing that we should probably clarify is that clean and unclean, clean is not clean, no, encountering things that are evil. There are plenty of the Old Testament that is described as unclean, but they're not evil, they're just unclean. Things that you encounter in daily life, in the course of your week. Unclean part of life. That's one way to think about it. Unclean is a part of life. But when you know that you've become unclean, it helps then do something to become clean again, right? It's not like, oh, leaving my house and my shoes get muddy, my pants get muddy after the course of, walking around in the rain and, sweat and all sorts of things, right? Your clothes get really dirty. If you're not changing your clothes, if you're not having a shower, like all that daily activity sort of builds up. You begin to smell. Your starts to suffer if you've not been regularly cleaning yourself. And so unclean, especially in this if the metaphor is in the course of unclean another. Maybe the gym, you've been outside, maybe you've been caught in a storm, you've been in those clothes, whatever it is. Point, you need to take those clothes off, you need to get changed, you need to have a shower, you need to wash your hair, you need to groom yourself. Now you're clean, right? In a literal sense. And that shouldn't be a stigma. Part of categories of cleanness, you could be, there's clean and unclean foods, let's say. There's clean and unclean states that you're in. You can't go into the temple unless you've ritually purified yourself, right? And all of these things serve a purpose. Understand what is clean mean? Let's look into it. Okay. The polarity here is between purity and impurity. It's a thing being what it really is consistently, like a glass of, you can drink a glass, but if it has contaminants, if it's dirty, if it's been corrupted by some agent, you don't drink that water. It's not pure. And I thought, what it sounds like to me is there are things in our daily life that affect our purity. Purity is like, I think the word gets used quite a lot in kind of, without first getting down to the fundamentals. My experience is there's an authenticity that I occupy, a comfort in being in my own skin, a genuineness that makes me emotionally available to around me, where I feel good in skin. I'm not acting out of reactionary tendencies. I'm not possessed by some agenda to serve some fear or preoccupation. I'm calm. And there are times when I'm able to check in somewhere, return of centeredness, grounded authenticity, out into my week. I go to a therapy session and I feel good. I feel more myself now. I feel unburdened. You go back out into your week, and there's stresses and anxieties, and people want things from you, and you want to do things, and you get stresses, and you have late nights, and then you eat junk food and spend too long on social media, and it's like, oh no, I've picked up all of these influences that have compromised central ground of authenticity. Authenticity being not however because I'm zoned out watching you, not be authentic. Authentic is I'm just going to let my whims, and I'm going to, whatever it is I have an impulse to pursue. To me, authenticity is I'm in tune with the image of God. I am grounded in myself. I am content. I am stable. I'm able to operate. That state is authenticity. That state is, and there are lots of things in life, but they have an influence on us where we become less of that. Now, in the Old Testament, they had rituals for purity. If the examples you can look up yourself. Point being, there were these rituals for purity, as if to say, okay, if you run into these issues, right, and you become decentered, for out coming back to center. I think water enacting purification in a physical, tangible, bodied kind of sometimes prayer. Imagine it as and sting, as if by confession. Here are the ways that I've gone off track, myself all messed up. I am now going through them. I'm taking inventory and I'm laying those down. And in doing so, there's a kind of grief that comes up as we kind of not only acknowledge that stuff, but sort of peeling back muddy, dirty clothes. The discomfort of peeling those and standing exposed is uncomfortable. There's a kind of grief that comes up, an emotional release as we lay down that old self, as it were. And I thought it was very interesting that the word for purification, remember, these are pure rituals. In the Greek, the word purification is the word catharsis. Now, in counseling, we're familiar with the word catharsis. It literally relates to that emotional release that feels like it's where something connects on the inside, and you're able to kind of let these emotions out. You're taking off the weight of those emotions, and afterwards, you feel sort of purging these feelings and expressing them, but you also feel lighter, feel more centered. You've come back to your so long kind of compelled to follow anxiety, to follow fear, to follow defensiveness, to guard. All the emotions going into those things has been through catharsis, through a kind of ritual of purification. Not, but it was a symbol for. And I think, okay, this is very interesting. We have authenticity and inauthenticity, influences that one to the other. And now we have exercises that we can involve ourselves in that help to reset ourselves, to come back to a centered place of authentic selfhood. This is very interesting. I don't think I've ever about it in these terms. Now, this notion of taking off clothes and putting them on again and putting others on, clean clothes, it's a motif that gets sort of brought up again in the New Testament. This notion of my sins are like filthy rags. My clothes are drenched in scarlet. There's all these images, like in Zechariah 3, let's say, where the central character, the protagonist of that vision, the angels on him remove his soiled clothes and put on him white garments. Testament. It's described, take off the old self with its corruption and desires and put on the new self, or put on Christ, as it were. It's almost as though we can, like, there is a process that we can enter into where we intentionally take stock of all the things that have been going on inside us, sometimes things that have been influenced by the outside. We take those off. We only take that inventory and stuff from them and say, okay, exposed now, vulnerable, having acknowledged the stuff that can't continue, I now put on something new, something clean. I now move forward cleanness. And that is akin to Christ himself. Christ, as if in the morning, light to self, old self that is, and we intentionally step into mode of being. In the that, like, people, David, out in the Psalms, things like, I wish I was born again. I don't know. Do you ever feel like through the course of your life, you've made mistakes, you've been damaged, you've been exposed to things, and you're no longer the person that you hoped you could be? That the influences in your life and where life has taken you have made you less than, have shaped you into a way that you don't want to be. And there's this kind of wish in the Old Testament. If only I go back to childhood, or be born and clean of all of those impurities that add up over time. Sometimes the rituals, and we pick up these things that distort who we are in the world, and we're not able to be who we want to be. This being born again and reset like that, being grafted into a new family with a new heritage and a new line of DNA that, that we're moved from, that we're like a branch that's been cut out of one tree, is dying, and grafted into a new tree, able to bear fruit from that new tree. These are the metaphors that get explored in the New Testament. These are the pictures that are constantly engaged throughout Scripture. They seem to be very, very real, own personal lived experiences. Now, it's one thing to consider how these rituals can help us reset. It's extremely valuable to have that. And we could be born again in a way, and all the impurities of an entire lifetime can be removed. That's so grand that Lord is fantasy. Another aspect of this, which is lived in an environment where there is uncleanness everywhere, And if you think of it in a literal sense, yes, we live in a world with lots of uncleanness. If I work on my car, I'm going to get my hands all greasy. If I go to the gym, my clothes are going to be all sweaty. If I... Yeah, there's plenty of things that make me unclean. If I have a whole deck, I'm going to feel so go to clean ourselves. Or it is explained through the literal concrete kind of reality of these things. But those metaphors to something that's more abstract but real. That's the point. A metaphor is taking something concrete to describe something else that's concrete, but it's still very... And these influences that affect us are real. They're real to our psychology. They're real to our relationships. They influence us in very tangible ways, but they're not concrete. So, one of the things that we are burdened with in the modern age is we don't have gated communities that impose boundaries upon us. That's a good thing in a way, because we have absolute freedom. That's we have so much, but that then responsibility onto us for some boundaries. Now, if you don't have boundaries, everything is trespassing on you. If you don't have boundaries around your life, things can come in and out that leave all kinds of messes. Things can come into your house, metaphorically, and take things out of the house that you didn't want to lose. We need boundaries that separate who we are from the chaos of the world, from the uncleanness of the world, from the influences of the world, from the ways that the world would present to us, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And it's like, no, I've made a decision who I want to be in the story of my own life. And because I've made that decision, I need to set parameters around what's valuable in my life. So we need to curate our lives. Years ago, I was so stressed and burnt out and trying to manage my life, and I read a book called Atomic Habits and realized, actually the first book that talked about this was a book called Willpower Doesn't Work. And I just loved the premise of that book, because it talked about how so much self-help that's been offered in the last 40 years or more, it promises that your life will change if only you exercise your willpower. And that sets up this, this false expectation that if someone fails, it's because of a lack of willpower. Try harder. That for a long time was the only wisdom that people had. If you're failing, try harder. And what this book, Willpower Doesn't Work, and then later Atomic Habits, which sort of took this idea even further, what they were saying was, you need to curate your environment, your immediate environment, and maybe concentric. You need to set intentions of what stays in that place and what needs to be taken outside of that place. You need to be intentional about what you expose yourselves to. You need to design your space. You need to design the habits that you want that sort of add to one another over a long period of time, taking you where you want to go. The outcomes that you want don't happen overnight. You need habits that help you make the journey. one step in front of another. Small atoms, the book describes, that come together to form an entire life. In fact, that's another fascinating concept here. We used to think of spiritual formation as being reflected in these practices, praying and fasting and Sabbath and um, uh, religious holidays and communion and all of these fixtures to ordinary life. Well, our ordinary lives now are not so ordinary. Those rituals existed in a culture and a society that no longer exists. The level of compensation we need to add to our current lives is so much bigger now. So this notion of, where was I? Curating our environments intentionally, curating our habits intentionally, and also curating our social circles intentionally. Deciding what we allow social circles, things like if there are people who don't respect your boundaries, who don't support who you are and who you want to be and where you're trying to go to. Oh, they're not on my team. I need to negotiate how I relate to this person, how much of them I allow into my house, metaphorically. I want to surround myself with other people who want to change who I am and where I'm going. I need to take from me more than I have to give. I'm giving to people who don't appreciate what you're sacrificing to give them. That's something inventory of and think, oh, maybe this giving is coming out of people pleasing. Maybe it's coming out of some unspoken promise that if I do X, Y, and Z, I will get something. That's part of the inventory. That's part of cleaning ourselves. Saying something like, wanting God's judgment, pleading for it. Search me, O God, to find if there is any evil way in me, any destructive tendency, any uncleanness, any impurity. Search me so that we can correct that and I can live more prosperously moving forward. We take stock. We separate ourselves from the uncleanness so that we can then put on the new self moving forward. And it's not, it's not a mystery what some of that uncleanness might be. I think most of us have sort of an intuition of, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing wrong. No one needs to tell me how I'm going off track. Stepping into that and saying, okay, I am now making a judgment. This stuff has to be put aside. So I want to say no to that stuff that's been ongoing and causing trouble so that I can start with something new. I say no to this so that I can say yes to this. So there you have it. That's probably that's probably most of what I'm fascinated by with a topic like this. That all of they relate to one another. The notion of clean and unclean being a way of differentiating those influences in our lives that contribute to us not being our true selves. There are influences in our life that cause us to be in a kind of low-grade state all day. There are people in our life that necessitate that we're kind of in this defense that is either people-pleasing, antagonism, or withdrawing, hiding. And our whole lives can be characterized by influences like these. And so recognizing this in the language of clean and unclean, and recognizing that these temptations highlight weaknesses so that we can address them, that we can participate in rituals that help us kind of come back to center. Therapy is a great ritualized unburdening and inventory that people can participate in. Same with pastoral care, prayer ministry, confession, like whatever it is you've got in your life. There are even people in your life that you can go to, and when you're finished spending time with them, you think, oh, I actually feel so much better. It's like, that is the purification process. Now, there's experiences of purification to help us clean what's become dirty. And then there's setting boundaries intentionally to stop us from getting unclean in the first place. It's funny how, like, scholars have gone back into the Old Testament and tried to understand the rationale for why some things were clean and other things were not, right? And some things that, oh, these foods were unclean because at the time they would have carried diseases and you would have become sick or something, you know. And there are other practices that were unclean for obvious reasons. And you discover something about like vibrations, the vibrational frequencies in clothing and crop cycles and germs, and it's like, oh, some of these made sense, right? But there's things within the clean and unclean system of the Old Testament that didn't make sense, and they didn't sort of adhere to that overall theory. And eventually, I think many Jewish people, the one they take is, the reason God gave us these clean and unclean rules differentiate us from the other nations and say, this is who we are. It didn't need more a rationale than that. Now, there might have been additional benefits, but that's the position many of them had to take. It's like, God asked us to do this, and sometimes there aren't reasons for it, but we're going to do it in obedience. And it's by heeding these parameters that we step into an assertion of, this is who we are, distinct from the world, and we are God's people. And I think if I've lost this concept that we should be in the world but not of the world. It's so hard to figure out what that even means. Part of it has to do with the boundaries that we set. That if we don't, where the parameters of our lives are, trespass against us, we will lose things that we need in order to move forward gracefully. And we'll become sort of infected or contaminated or impurified. These impurities within our glass of water. Anyway, you get the idea. So, where to from here? You know, I've not looked at this through the lens of what Jesus talked about, clean and unclean. I remember him saying, you Pharisees think that eating and drinking will make you unclean. But you swallow a gnat and you strain a gnat and swallow a camel. Your priorities are all mixed. You're on the and you're minoring on major things. You need to prioritize what's important, taking care of the socially disenfranchised, and setting your moral compass in order, and not thinking that the religious stuff is important in and of itself. Looking at people and how you can see interests of others. Like, he understood what it was that was supposed to be cleaned, was something deep within our own souls, our tendency to develop coping mechanisms and to compromise our character with these prosthetic dimensions we are that don't grow. They're not responsive, and in ways that need to be softened. Jesus did something really interesting, I remember. If you recall the New Testament, clean and uncleanness. A leper is unclean physically. The contagious skin disease that they have, they're unclean. Was that if you're clean and you come in contact with someone, then you will become unclean, right? The movement of influence seems to be from unclean things to clean things, corrupting them, right? Even if only a little bit of dirt gets into a glass of water, it contaminates the whole glass of water, right? It spreads. It has that, and so being motif as if, oh no, we need to stay from all things that are, if you become unclean, you have to wash yourself immediately. It became this anxious thing. This thing where we're the clean ones. We're not those unclean people who don't have those from, the influences of daily life. But Jesus did something very interesting. Jesus wasn't just clean. Jesus was holy. Fascinating idea. What you see in the New Testament, rather, is Jesus, who is holy, makes contact with what is unclean. Clean, he would get infected by the unclean. Instead, the uncleanness got infected by the holiness. That's a whole nother level of influence. Instead of your cleanness being on the defensive from what's unclean, I need to put boundaries around myself. I need to organize my I need to make sure that things don't come in that are contaminated. When I notice that I am acting out of accord with my authenticity, attention to that and address it, and go to my therapist and take stock and purify myself. All of that is helpful. All of that is important to ongoing practice. But there's something that puts unclean on the defensive. There is something that unclean cannot, it's impenetrable to it. In fact, it changes the tide and it spreads instead of being affected by it. Sorry, it spreads cleanness instead of uncleanness being what spreads. Now, what is it that it is? Holiness. Now, this thing about holiness, I'm not going to dive deeply into this notion, but the word holy in the New Testament, it's the same word as sanctification. It's the same word that we get the word saint, actually. So you've got saint, holy, same word. Okay, so what is a saint if not someone who is being sanctified and someone holy? It's not perfect, but I'm pretty sure that the word holy is not too far removed from the concept that we have today of being whole. What does it mean to be whole? That disparate parts of you aren't fractured, but united. That there's an integrity to your character. That there's a consistency with who you are and how you act. There's a maturity that can accommodate stress and dysfunction and chaos and other people's stuff. You are so held together within yourself. You are so mature of your own lived experience, and I would say journey with God, that you can encounter dysfunction. You can encounter the uncleanness of the world. But you have enough integrity within you that you're not being affected by it, but you're the one affecting them. In a way, it's something like what counselors do, like being a counselor, and you're seeing people, like, depending on what kind of counselor you are, but people come to you with their emotional baggage, with their dysfunctions, going wrestling with their abuse and childhood trauma, and with their ongoing dysfunctions and disorders. Seeing day after day, how does a counselor protect himself from that level of exposure, that level of influence? Isn't he becoming unclean all the time? Sometimes. It's part of getting into the messiness and of life that, like Jesus did, households of tax collectors and prostitutes, and encountering people are kind of on the underside of society, and Samaritans, and not the clean ones, not the Pharisees, but encountering the Pharisees too, and saying, you guys think you're clean, but you're whitewashed tombs. What's inside is actually dead men's bones. You're more unclean than you realize because you've only put years over your uncleanness. You think you're clean. You think you can see, but you're actually blind and wretched. There's a level of uncleanness that goes right down to the bones. But how a counselor does this, and I expect how Jesus does this too. There are two. One is that you begin a centeredness, a groundedness. You've put on Christ, as it were. And because you don't need anything, because you're not fighting for anything, the counselor is able to sit with the client, ideally, and just be. This is the practice that I find myself, practice. It's not perfect. I don't always show up that way, but I feel is that if I can exhale and I can show up and be with my client in their troubles, then we can walk out of those. We can make things better if I'm able to just be where they are. I think Jesus did that same thing. He had a maturity integrity about him. He knew who he was. And so he could go into unclean places. He could clean people. But he wasn't affected by them. Instead, he brought his wholeness to people who were unclean, and he helped lift them up into being clean. He helped them take off influences that were holding them where they're at. Imagine being so caked in dirt and mud and grime, that you literally can't stand up because your clothes are heavy and sort of fused to the ground. Jesus says, I'm going to take off those dirty clothes and I'm going to give you white so that you can now walk out of that messy pit that you've been all this time. The part, of course, is to engage in ritual purification. But sometimes that looks like retreat from the world. You've gone out, now it's time to come. You've engaged, now it's time to retreat. There was a Jesus ministry where he would often go out to lonely places, up to mountains, and God. He abided with God, his Father, so that when he came back into the world, he could say, I only do what I'm mindful of what the Father is doing in our midst. I'm not going to exert myself any more than I see God doing ahead of me. And because of that, I'm able to stay in my center. I'm able to rest in my activity. That's a special kind of wholeness that I don't think many of us practice nowadays. Many of us don't talk about this even being an option, that we can engage, reach. This going out, a balance between exertion and retreat. And then, of course, there's the curation. Who do I surround myself with? Now, one could argue that Judas got past him. Whether, Jesus allowed him to join his disciples, but otherwise, Jesus, who he was going to his inner circle, the disciples, followers and believers, friends of his, like the household of Lazarus, like he knew who he wanted to surround himself with. So there's a curation going on. And I think these are kind of the different levels as we're kind of unpacking this motif of clean and unclean. There are all of these different concepts that feed into an overall vision for how this works. It becomes a framework that we can sort of be informed by as we curate our own lives, as we encounter difficulties and influences, and we realize, oh, a lot of the channels I watch on YouTube aren't good for me. Great. You've become aware of something. Now what will you do? Will you place boundaries around it? Will you, how strict are those? How far are those boundaries? App blocker on my phone that stops me from watching reels for too long. If I've been watching reels for like 30 seconds or something, a window will pop up and stop me from being able to use the social media. And it's like, it's so frustrating. But it's a necessary boundary. Habits that I've had to say goodbye to, sacrifice, a number of things that I just no longer have energy for in my life. I no longer have room for doing all of these different things because I've decided I'm trying to get somewhere. In fact, as I'm sharing this, there are still things that I need to curate in part of my life. Some of them have to do with diet. Some of them have to do with how I spend my time and my energy. Some of it has to do with where I notice I'm losing energy so that I'm not able to live up to the pattern that I want. There are things that are taking me away from a centered communion with God, and there are things that help bring me back to it. It's to be mindful of these things. because they're going to be different. What seems to be consistent is the framework itself, that helps highlight these different things, these different needs, these different wants, and to equip us with the direction that we need when the world is only offering us freedom. Sometimes freedom in ways that are destructive. I'm reminded by what I think it was Paul who wrote. I think he was quoting someone else in his response to one of the churches. Was the quote. But he says, no. Everything might be permissible. You know, you become an adult, you've got a job, you've got money, you're living on your own. No one is policing you. No one is looking over your shoulder and telling you what you ought to do. Is it beneficial? Is it taking you where you want to be? That's a different story. And sometimes we allow freedom in our lives that becomes detrimental to us. That's okay. We're the only ones suffering the consequences. Of course, sometimes there are other people who are suffering the consequences with us. But we are the ones who need to step up and take responsibility for those changes. We need to take responsibility for being mindful of where our lives need attention. And we need to architect a life that we can live in. And it's also my comprehension that if you're able to properly steward your own life, you can then have a connection with someone else and build a joint life around that connection, to feed it, to build it in the same way that you foster and protect and edify the connection you have within yourself. And if you can do it on an individual level, if you can do it in your primary relationship, to manage a house that protects that connect, allows kids to grow up in the midst of that relational field so that they have maturity as well. And maybe you meet other people whose households are functioning the same way. Now you've got a community of people who are living in a way that is safeguarding this essential connection with their own humanity. You're able to lean on one another and support one another. You're able to move in the same direction, maintaining the boundaries of that together. Now you've got something like a kingdom. You've got something like this kingdom that functions a certain way, hopefully towards growth, towards each person in that realm into their own authenticity, learning the function in their lives in such a way that cultivates growth. Now you've got a garden just in your own life, not just in your own household, not only between households, but you've got into the city of Revelation. The beginning of the Bible starts with a garden, co-cultivated by Adam and Eve. In the end of the Bible, you have a city of gardens, cultivated by many people. The promise in Zechariah 3, but it's also like a few other places as well. This notion that one day each person will rest under the shade of their own fig tree, their own vine. You will have this peace that comes from having carved out a place carefully cultivated that is apart from the chaos of the world. There is low logos, and then there is the tohu vavohu, is abundant and chaotic and hostile and amazing. And we need to set intentions, ordering that chaos into a garden. When I think of discipleship, this is quintessentially what I imagine. Not Jesus' disciples, first and foremost, learning from Jesus how to live a moral life, but Adam in the Garden of Eden, learning how to cultivate the world. If that comes first, people find themselves more able to function, provide, like, I think the moral teach Jesus gives are only possible someone who's been able to take off their old self and put on Christ. The moral precepts of Jesus are not possible for just people trying the moral life in their old state, affected by all the things of the world indiscriminately. The ethics of Jesus, the morals that Jesus taught, are only possible if a person is in Christ, empowered from the inside with this grounded clarity and authenticity. If they are living from the image of God, like Adam did before he exited the garden. And so discipleship today has to be a kind of learning how to cultivate that garden once more. How to steward a life, a connection with God, not only in theory, but in embodied experience. That's a much better place to leave it. A lot of different concepts. Enjoy. That's been fantastic to share this